My aunt called me a gold digger in front of complete strangers. She said I'd spent years living off my late uncle, waiting for my chance to take what wasn't mine. Nobody in that room knew the truth. For 6 years, I had quietly paid the mortgage, the insurance, even his medical bills, while she took credit for keeping the family together. I never defended myself. Not because I couldn't, because I had every receipt. And sometimes the truth is far more powerful when you let people bury themselves first. 8 years passed. She told everyone I had stayed for the money. Family members stopped calling. Invitations disappeared. I became the villain in a story I never even got the chance to tell. Then one afternoon, my phone rang. The same aunt who had thrown me out after my uncle's funeral suddenly needed $11,000 to save her house and her car. She thought I'd forgotten everything. She had no idea I walked into that meeting carrying a single navy blue folder containing 74 months of bank statements, and what happened after I opened that folder changed our family forever. Let me take you back to where it all began. My name is Mara Kessler, and I am 34 years old. 3 weeks ago, my Aunt Deborah stood in her son's kitchen and asked me for $11,000 to keep her car from being repossessed for the second time that year. She asked with her voice pitched soft, the way she used to ask Uncle Walt for grocery money, and in the same breath she told my cousin's fiancée, a woman I'd met 20 minutes earlier, that I'd always been good with numbers, ever since I lived off my uncle. Nobody in that kitchen knew I've spent the last 8 years as a licensed financial investigator tracing exactly where other people's money actually went. Nobody knew that in a navy blue expandable folder in my hallway closet, I had 74 months of statements proving who really kept her house standing after Walt died. But here's what she didn't know yet. That folder was never built for this moment. It was just the truth, filed in date order, waiting for somebody to finally ask the right question. If you're new here, this is the kind of story I tell. Quiet ones, true ones, about the exact moment someone stops accepting the version of themselves their family invented. If that sounds like your kind of story too, subscribe, but only if this one earns it. And if you've ever been the person who kept the receipts nobody thought to check, tell me about it in the comments. I read every one. Let me take you back. Not to the funeral. Further than that. I grew up in Fairhaven, a town of about 6,000 people built around one intersection, a Methodist church, and my uncle's hardware store on Main Street, which had been Kessler Hardware since his father hung the sign in 1961. My parents split when I was 11. My mother moved 3 states away chasing a job that never quite paid what it promised, and my father remarried fast and got quiet in a way that made visits feel like something he was scheduling rather than wanting. By the time I turned 18, my mother could send me $200 a month if she was careful, and my father sent birthday cards. That was the shape of my family before any of this started. Uncle Walt was my mother's older brother, and he and Aunt Deborah lived in a 3-bedroom house on Larchmont Street, 12 minutes from the state college I got into on a partial scholarship. When my mother called him and asked carefully whether I could stay there for school, Walt said yes before she finished the sentence. Deborah said yes too, though I remember the pause before she did. 4 seconds. I didn't count it back then. I counted it later, replaying it, the way you replay things once you know how a story ends. Walt himself was the kind of man who measured affection in tasks rather than words. He didn't hug much, didn't say I love you the way my mother did, but he taught me how to read a lease before I signed one, how to check a car's oil without being talked into an unnecessary repair, how to ask a landlord a question in a way that got a straight answer instead of a runaround. He used to say the store had taught him that most people don't lie outright, they just let you assume things that are convenient for them, and that the only defense against that was reading everything twice. I didn't know, at 19, that he was handing me the exact skill set I'd end up needing to survive his own household a few years later. Their own kids were mostly grown. Brian was 24 and living an hour away. Jenna was 20 and still around most weekends. I moved into the spare room above the garage with one suitcase, a laptop my mother had financed at 19% interest, and a box of textbooks. I got a work-study job at the campus library and picked up shifts at the hardware store on weekends, ringing up paint and stocking screws, and Walt paid me the same as he paid anyone else on the floor, which I appreciated more than I ever told him. Ruth introduced herself the second week I lived on Larchmont, standing at the edge of her driveway in gardening gloves while I unloaded a mattress from Walt's truck. "You're the niece," she said. Not a question, the kind of statement small towns make about you before you've had a chance to make it yourself. "I'm Ruth. I've got tomatoes coming in faster than I can eat them, so you're going to be eating some whether you like it or not." I liked her before I'd finished carrying the mattress up the stairs. The first small proof of where I stood in that house came 6 weeks in, on Jenna's 20th birthday. Deborah threw her a party with a rented bounce house in the backyard, even though Jenna was 20 and hadn't asked for one, because Deborah liked an occasion. Nobody mentioned my birthday that year, which had passed 9 days earlier. I'm not saying that to sound sorry for myself. I'm saying it because it was the first entry in a ledger I didn't know yet that I was keeping. Brian, 4 years older than me, was already living on his own by the time I arrived, and he treated my presence in the house the way you'd treat a piece of furniture that had shown up without explanation, not unkind, just uninterested. It was Jenna and Deborah who shared the house with me day to day, and it was Deborah who set the temperature of the place, usually without saying anything at all. She wasn't cruel in those early years, she was careful in a way that felt worse. The kind of careful where every kindness came with an invisible ledger of its own, one she never let me see the balance of until I'd already spent years assuming it was even. The person who noticed was Ruth Alvarez, who lived across the street and had known Walt since before he married Deborah. Ruth was 71 when I moved in, widowed, and she kept a garden that took up her entire backyard and half her mornings. She showed up on my actual birthday with a grocery store cake and a card that said, in handwriting that shook a little, "Nobody should turn 19 without cake." She sat with me on her porch and asked about my classes, like the answers actually mattered to her. That became a Sunday habit. Grilled cheese, black coffee she let me drink even though I didn't like it yet, and 40 minutes of somebody asking real questions. Ruth never once made a big gesture. She just kept showing up, which turned out to be the only kind of love in that story that never came with a condition attached. The second entry in that ledger came the following spring, when Jenna's car broke down and Deborah replaced it within the week with a used sedan that cost $4,300, paid in cash from a savings account I later learned Walt had been contributing to for years without telling me. My own car, a 14-year-old hatchback my mother had passed down to me, needed a transmission that same semester. I worked an extra 11 hours a week at the library to cover it myself, which took most of a summer. I didn't resent Jenna for the sedan. I was 20 and mostly just tired. But I noticed, the way you notice a crack in a foundation long before anyone calls it structural, that certain needs in that house got met on site and others got met by me finding a way. I studied accounting mostly because it was the one thing in my life that made sense when nothing else did. Numbers didn't have moods. A ledger either balanced or it told you exactly why it didn't, and I found that more honest than most people I knew. I graduated with a degree and a job offer from a regional accounting firm 40 minutes from Fairhaven, starting at $41,300 a year, and I stayed on Larchmont Street 2 more years than I'd planned, because by then Walt was sick. Walt's heart had been failing slowly since I was in college, though he was the kind of man who called a cardiac event a bad afternoon and went back to the store 2 days later against every doctor's advice. By the time I was 20, he was on disability, pulling in $1,850 a month, and the store's income had thinned to almost nothing because he could no longer work the floor and couldn't afford to hire someone full-time to replace him. Deborah managed the household the way she'd always managed it, which is to say she didn't, not really. Bills came in manila envelopes and sat on the kitchen counter until the phone started ringing. I found this out by accident the week I noticed the porch light hadn't worked in 4 days and asked about it, and Walt told me, embarrassed, that the electric company had sent a shut-off notice. I didn't decide to fix it. I just did what I'd been doing with my own accounts since I was 19, which was open the folder, look at the numbers, and figure out what needed to happen next. I set up an automatic transfer from my checking account to cover the mortgage, $1,140 a month, because it was 2 months behind and the next missed payment would trigger a default notice. I added the homeowner's insurance, $212 a month, after I found a cancellation letter from the carrier folded inside a coupon circular. I covered Walt's prescription copays when his supplemental coverage lapsed for a stretch nobody had noticed. None of this was a loan on paper. Walt asked me to take it over because, in his words, "You're the only one in this house who reads what the paper says instead of what she wishes it said." I didn't argue with that. I just started a spreadsheet because that's what I do when something matters and nobody else is tracking it. This went on for a little over 6 years. 74 months to be exact, though I didn't count it in real time back then. I counted it after, going back through my own bank records the way you count anything you needed to prove happened. During those years, Deborah's version of events was that Walt handled the finances, which was technically true in the sense that his name was on the account I paid into. She never asked where the money came from. I used to think that was willful. Now I think it was simpler than that. She didn't want to know, because knowing would have meant owing something, and Deborah had built a life around never being the one who owed. Ruth, meanwhile, kept showing up every Sunday, grilled cheese and real questions, through all 6 years. When Walt was hospitalized for 11 days that fourth winter, Ruth drove me to visiting hours every evening because my car needed a transmission I couldn't afford yet, and she never once mentioned the gas money. The worst of it came that same winter, a stretch in February when Walt's disability check was delayed by a processing error at the state office, and the store brought in almost nothing for 3 straight weeks because a pipe had burst and flooded half the inventory. I remember sitting at my own kitchen table, the one in my first studio apartment, doing the math 3 separate times because I didn't trust the first 2 answers, trying to work out whether I could cover the mortgage, the insurance, and my own rent on a paycheck that hadn't grown much since I'd started. I could, barely, if I skipped groceries that weren't already in the cabinet and put off getting my brakes looked at for another month. I did both. Nobody on Larchmont Street ever knew that February happened the way it happened. I never told them, because telling them would have meant admitting how close it came to not working, and some part of me still needed it to look effortless even to myself. Walt died on a Tuesday in March, of a heart attack in the store's back office, 3 days before his 63rd birthday. I found out because his part-time clerk called me directly, not Deborah, because in 6 years of paying that store's supplier invoices out of the household account, everyone who worked there had learned my number faster than hers. The wake was at the funeral home on Route 9. I stood near the back because that felt like the right place to stand. Deborah stood at the front receiving line for 3 hours, and around the second hour, a cousin of Walt's I barely knew asked her, not unkindly, how she was holding up with everything Walt handled. Deborah's answer, delivered loud enough that I heard it from 15 feet away, was this: "Oh, Walt didn't handle much toward the end. Mostly it was just me and my niece here, playing house." That was the first version of the story. It would change by morning. I want to be precise about what actually happened that night, because precision is the only thing I have ever trusted more than memory. We got back from the funeral home a little after 9. Deborah had been drinking wine since the reception, not a scene-making amount, just enough to loosen something that had been tightening in her for 6 years. Jenna had gone back to her own apartment. Brian was staying at a hotel with his then-girlfriend. It was Deborah, me, and the quiet of a house that no longer had Walt's television going in the next room. She started with the mortgage statement, which had come that week and which she'd opened without understanding, because it listed a balance far lower than she'd expected, the kind of balance you get after 6 years of steady payments instead of 6 years of near defaults. "Why does this look like this?" she said. Not a question. An accusation waiting for a shape. I told her the truth, plainly, the way I'd tell a client the truth about their own books. I'd been covering the mortgage and the insurance since I was 20. Walt had asked me to. I had the transfers, the confirmations, 6 years of them, if she wanted to see. 17 seconds of silence? I counted them, because counting is what I do instead of flinching. Then she said the sentence I would carry for 8 years: "You were never family here. You were just waiting for your turn." I didn't yell. I remember being strangely calm, the way I've learned to be calm when a client's spouse realizes, mid-audit, exactly how much has gone missing. I told her that wasn't true, that I'd paid because Walt asked me to and because I loved him, not because I was owed anything. She wasn't interested in that answer. She told me to pack my things that night, that a 26-year-old woman playing house with a dying man's finances had no business staying under his widow's roof one more day. I packed 1 suitcase. I left the rest. Most of it clothes and books that didn't matter because arguing for them would have meant staying in that kitchen longer than I could stand. Ruth's porch light was still on across the street. I sat on her steps at 11 that night, and she opened the door before I even knocked, like she'd been watching for me, which, knowing Ruth, she probably had been. By the following week, the story had a final shape, and it wasn't the one where I'd paid a mortgage for 6 years out of a paycheck, earning $41,000 when I started. It was the one where Walt's niece had stayed for the money and gotten thrown out the second the money stopped. Distant cousins repeated it at a wedding I wasn't invited to. A woman from Deborah's church told my former high school guidance counselor, who mentioned it to my mother, who called me crying, not because she believed it, but because she couldn't stop other people from believing it. The story didn't need to be true. It just needed to be told confidently, by a grieving widow, to people who had no reason to check. I woke up on Ruth's pull-out couch the next morning to the smell of coffee and the sound of her radio playing low in the kitchen, and for about 4 seconds before I remembered, I forgot anything had happened at all. Ruth didn't ask me to talk about it that first morning. She just set a plate of toast in front of me and said, "Eat something, then we'll figure out the rest," which turned out to be exactly the right amount of comfort for someone who wasn't ready yet to say any of it out loud. I didn't correct it. I want to be honest about why. Correcting it would have meant producing proof, and producing proof, at 26, felt like something a person does when they're trying to win, and I didn't want to be a person trying to win against my dead uncle's wife 3 weeks after his funeral. So I let it stand, packed my one suitcase into Ruth's guest room for the 2 months it took me to find an apartment, and I kept the folder. I didn't build it for a fight. I just couldn't bring myself to throw 6 years of proof away. Before I go further, if any part of this is landing somewhere real for you, if you've ever watched a family rewrite you into the villain of a story you actually paid for, I want to hear it. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It helps more than you'd think, knowing this isn't just my story. Ruth let me stay in her guest room through May, and I never once heard her frame it as charity. She'd knock on the door most mornings with coffee I'd finally learned to like, and ask what I had going on that day, the same question she'd been asking since I was 19, and somewhere in those 2 months I understood that Ruth had been the actual constant in my life for 7 years, not the family whose name I shared. I found a one-bedroom apartment 20 minutes away for $690 a month, furnished it slowly with things from a second-hand shop on Route 9, and I went back to work at the accounting firm, where nobody knew or cared what had happened on Larchmont Street. That turned out to be a relief I hadn't expected. At work, I was just Mara, the associate who caught a $5,000 reconciliation error in a client's payroll ledger during her second month. The one who stayed late without complaining, the one who read footnotes other people skipped. My manager at the time, a woman named Priya who ran the firm's small fraud examination unit, pulled me aside about 8 months after Walt died and told me I had the instincts for forensic work, the kind that involves finding money that someone worked hard to make disappear. I laughed at the time because it felt like she was describing my own family and calling it a career path. But she wasn't wrong. I studied for the Certified Fraud Examiner credential in the evenings, on Ruth's dining table most Sundays, with Ruth reading her gardening catalogs across from me and asking quiz questions from my study guide even though she didn't understand half of them. I passed the exam at 28. I moved into the firm's investigations division at 29, mostly working elder financial exploitation cases, which I've never once found ironic in the way people assume I would. If anything, it made the work feel like it had a spine to it. I know exactly what it looks like when someone quietly drains an aging relative's account and calls it help. I also know exactly what it looks like when someone quietly protects one instead and gets called a thief for it. Year 1 after Larchmont was the hardest, financially and otherwise. I was making $41,000, paying rent, and still occasionally getting a text from my mother asking if I'd smooth things over with Deborah, as if the thing that needed smoothing was my side of it. Ruth's Sunday grilled cheese was, some weeks, the only hot meal I ate that wasn't reheated. But by the end of that year, I'd caught the payroll error that got Priya's attention, and I'd started sleeping through the night again, which I hadn't been doing since March. Year 2, Deborah sold the store's remaining inventory to the chain that turned it into a vape shop. I found out from Jenna, not from Deborah, in a text that read only, "They're gutting Grandpa's old sign next week if you want a picture of it." I drove out on a Sunday when I knew no one would be there and took a photo of the Kessler hardware sign leaning against a dumpster before it went to the scrapyard, the paint on the K already peeling from 31 years of weather. I still have that photo. I've never shown it to anyone in that family. That same year, Ruth's knees finally gave out on the porch steps she'd been climbing every day for 2 decades, and I started coming by twice a week instead of once, not because she asked, but because I'd learned by then that the people who show up without being asked are the only ones worth counting on. Year 3, I studied for my CFE exam at Ruth's dining table most Sunday nights, and Ruth, who had never balanced anything more complicated than a checkbook, quizzed me from my study guide anyway, mispronouncing terms like predication and restitution with a seriousness that made the studying feel less lonely than it should have. She kept a running tally of my practice scores on a yellow legal pad taped to her refrigerator, the same way she used to track her tomato yields, and she cheered the same way for both. That same year, Deborah remarried, a man named Gary I'd never met, at a courthouse ceremony I heard about secondhand, 3 weeks after it happened, from a cousin who assumed I already knew. If you've made it this far, I want to pause here for a second. This channel exists because I think the quiet years, the ones where nothing dramatic happens and you're just getting up and doing the next right thing anyway, matter as much as the confrontation everyone's waiting for. If a year like that is where you are right now, tell me in the comments. I promise the boring years count. Year 4, I passed the CFE exam and moved into the firm's investigations division. That same year, I heard through my mother that Gary had co-signed Deborah onto a home equity line of credit against the Larchmont house, ostensibly to fix the roof, though the roof, as far as I ever heard, never got fixed. I didn't reach out. It wasn't my house anymore, and more than that, it wasn't my responsibility to rescue a decision I hadn't been told about and wouldn't have been thanked for questioning. Year 5, Gary left, 14 months into the marriage, taking very little with him except the debt he'd helped create. I learned this the way I learned most things about that family by then. Through Jenna, who by that point had started texting me small updates every few months, never asking for anything, just keeping a thread open in case I ever wanted to walk back through it. I didn't respond to most of them. I answered enough to let her know the door wasn't locked, just closed. Year 6, I bought my condo. A modest 2-bedroom with a mortgage I paid myself, on time, every month, in a system of auto transfers I'd built with the same care I once brought to a house that was never mine. Ruth brought a fern to the closing that I have somehow, against all odds, kept alive. Owen and I had been together 8 months by then, and he helped me move boxes up 2 flights of stairs without once asking why my mother was the only blood relative on my moving day guest list. He asked me about it that night instead, quietly, over pizza on the floor of an unfurnished living room, and I told him the whole story for the first time, start to finish, without editing any of it down to make myself sound less exhausted by it. That's the shape of the 6 years nobody in my family was watching. Not because I was hiding it, because nobody had asked. I never called it a ledger out loud, not back then, but that's what it was, and it ran in 2 columns whether I meant it to or not. Item 1, on the side of erasure. The Christmas after I moved out, when a card addressed to me at my new apartment showed up 2 weeks late with no gift inside and no return address, forwarded from Larchmont in an envelope Deborah hadn't bothered to reseal properly, meaning she'd read it before deciding to send it on at all. Item 1, on the side of care, that same December, Ruth handed me a wrapped box on her porch that turned out to be a coat, a real one, wool, the kind I couldn't have afforded that year, with a note that said only, "So you stop pretending your denim jacket is enough in January." Item 2, erasure. My 30th birthday, which passed without a single text from anyone on Larchmont Street, though I later learned, through Jenna, that Deborah had thrown Brian's fiancé an engagement party that same week with a 4-tier cake and a hired photographer. Item 2, care. Ruth threw me a 30th birthday dinner in her own dining room, 6 people total, mismatched chairs pulled in from 3 different rooms, and she made a toast that started with, "To the only Kessler who ever actually earned the name," and made me cry into a plate of lasagna in front of people I'd known less than a year. Item 3, erasure. The year I made senior associate, a milestone I mentioned once, briefly, to my mother, who mentioned it to a cousin who apparently mentioned it to Deborah, who responded, according to Jenna, with a single line, "Good for her, I suppose, since she never did have anyone to answer to." Item 3, care. Priya, my manager, took me to lunch that same week and told me plainly, without any of the hedging people use when they're trying to be encouraging without meaning it, that I was the best hire she'd made in a decade. I believed her more than I believed almost anyone in the 8 years before that. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to make this sound like a competition Deborah lost. It wasn't a competition. I wasn't counting these things to prove she loved me less than Ruth did. I was counting them the way I count everything, because counting is how I've always made sense of what's actually happening underneath what people say is happening. And what was actually happening underneath 8 years of a story about a gold digger who'd stayed for the money was a much simpler and much sadder arithmetic. The people who owed me nothing kept showing up anyway, and the people who owed me an explanation never once tried to give one. I want to be clear about something, because this genre of story tends to skip it. I was not building a case against my aunt during any of this. I was not saving statements with her in mind. I kept my old bank records the way any financial investigator keeps records, out of habit and training, filed by year in a navy blue expandable folder that started as 6 manila envelopes from the Larchmont years and grew, over time, into something closer to an archive. Mortgage confirmations. Insurance payment records. The 2 years of prescription receipts I paid at the pharmacy counter with my own debit card. Later, when I got my CFE license, I requested my own historical account statements from my bank going back further than they normally keep on hand. Not because I needed them for anything, but because a person who spends her working life proving what happened to money develops a reflex about her own money too. Meanwhile, Deborah's version of the story kept circulating at a low, steady hum. I didn't hear most of it directly. I heard it secondhand, the way you hear about weather in a town you don't live in anymore, from my mother, occasionally from Jenna, who I stayed loosely in touch with despite everything, mostly through birthday texts and the odd photo of her dog. Jenna was the one who told me, 3 years after the funeral, that Deborah had sold the hardware store's remaining inventory and the building itself to a chain that turned it into a vape shop, and that she'd used most of the proceeds to pay off debts on the house that I hadn't known existed. That was the first sign I had that Deborah's finances, without Walt's discipline or my 6 years of quiet coverage, weren't stable. I didn't investigate it. It wasn't my business anymore, and I meant that. By year 4, Ruth's garden had gotten too much for her knees, And I started coming by most Saturdays to help with the beds, which turned into staying for dinner, which turned into Ruth becoming, in every way that matters, the person I called first when anything good or bad happened. When I made senior associate, she was the first call. When I bought my own condo at 31, a modest 2-bedroom with a mortgage I paid myself, on time, every month, because I'd learned exactly what happens when payments slip, Ruth was the one who brought a plant to the closing. By year 6, I'd started dating Owen, a structural engineer I'd met through a mutual friend, steady and unbothered by my habit of double-checking restaurant bills out of professional reflex. He met Ruth before he met anyone from my actual family, which tells you everything about how I'd sorted the word family by then. By year 7, I made partner track senior investigator at the firm, and the local business journal ran a short feature on the firm's fraud unit that mentioned my name in a caption under a group photo. I didn't think much of it. It ran online, buried 3 pages deep in a business section nobody in Fairhaven reads. I called my mother that night, mostly out of habit, and she was quiet for a second before she said, "Walt would have put that in the store's front window, you know. Right next to the door." I hadn't expected that to land the way it did. I hadn't heard anyone connect me to Walt, in a good way, in 7 years. Except Brian's fiancée followed the journal's social media account for wedding vendor listings, and she happened to see the photo, and she happened to mention it in a family group text that, as it turned out, still had me on it from a cousin's graduation 2 years earlier that nobody had bothered to remove me from. That was how the family found out I existed again, not because I told them anything, because a caption under a stock photo of a conference room outlived a grudge nobody had thought to close the loop on. I didn't see the message when it was sent. I saw it 4 days later, when Jenna texted me privately, out of what I now understand was guilt. A single screenshot with no caption of her own, just the image and 3 dots that meant she was typing something she ultimately never sent. The screenshot was from the family group chat, the one I was apparently still on but had muted 2 years earlier without realizing anyone still used it. It showed 6 messages in a row, starting with Brian's fiancée sharing the business journal photo with the caption, "Isn't this Mara?" Followed by Brian writing, "Damn, she made partner or something," followed by Deborah 40 minutes later writing the message that ended up mattering most, "Interesting timing. The house is behind on everything again, and the bank's already sent 1 letter. Make a list of everything, be specific, she's a numbers person now, might as well put it to use." I read that message the way I read a suspicious transaction, twice, slowly, checking for a version of it that meant something other than what it obviously meant. There wasn't one. In my actual job, I spend my days looking for exactly this pattern, a sudden warmth toward an aging or newly successful relative that arrives suspiciously close behind a piece of financial news. I've written that pattern up in case files under headers like relationship of convenience and asset event contact. I never once expected to recognize it in a screenshot of my own family's group chat. I scrolled up and found 6 more messages above the ones Jenna had shown me, sent over the following 2 days, that filled in the rest of the picture. Brian had asked at one point whether I'd actually gotten cold toward the family or if that was more Mom's version of things. Deborah's answer 3 minutes later was, "Doesn't matter which version is true. What matters is she's the one with a job now." I sat with that sentence longer than any of the others. 8 years of a story that didn't need to be true, followed by an 8-word confirmation that even the person telling it knew that. 8 years after telling me I'd never been family, my aunt's first instinct on learning I'd become financially stable wasn't relief that a family member was doing well. It was a spreadsheet request. I didn't respond in the group chat because I'd been removed from viewing it in real time, apparently, by whatever settings governed a chat I hadn't opened in 2 years. I didn't call Deborah. I didn't call Brian. What I did was the same thing I would have done with any client who just discovered a pattern in someone else's behavior. I documented it. I saved the screenshot with a timestamp note. I told exactly one person, Owen, that evening, over dinner, calmly, the way I've trained myself to deliver bad news at work, facts first, feelings after. The following week, out of the same instinct that makes me confirm a client's legal standing before I ever open a case file, I met with an estate and family law attorney my firm works with regularly, not to prepare an attack, but to understand my own position. I wanted to know, plainly, whether 6 years of documented mortgage and insurance payments on a property I never held title to created any legal claim I should be aware of, protecting or otherwise. The answer was more nuanced than a movie would have you believe. I had no ownership claim. What I had was a clean, dated, third-party verifiable record of exactly who kept that house solvent during the years it mattered most, which, the attorney pointed out, is its own kind of asset. Not one you can cash. One you can be believed with. I want to be honest that I felt something close to grief in that meeting, more than anger. 8 years of being quietly, correctly, thoroughly right about my own life, and it had taken a caption under a stock photo to make anyone in that family curious enough to ask what I'd actually been doing since they threw me out. I told exactly one person at work about it too, not for advice, but because I needed to say it out loud to someone who understood the shape of what I was looking at. Priya read the screenshot twice, the same way I had, and set her phone down slowly. "This is a textbook pattern," she said. "If a client brought me this, I'd tell them the same thing I'm about to tell you. Document everything, talk to someone about your own protections, and don't let anyone rush you into a room before you're ready." She didn't say it like a boss delivering a lecture. She said it like someone who'd seen this exact shape too many times in other people's families to let me walk into it unprepared. The attorney, a measured woman named Fatima Osei, who'd handled 2 of my firm's referral cases before, asked me one question that stuck with me longer than anything else in that meeting. "What do you actually want out of this?" she said. "If it goes the way you think it will." I sat with that longer than felt comfortable in a build hour. What I wanted, it turned out, wasn't money, and it wasn't an apology I didn't trust anyway. What I wanted was for the record to exist somewhere outside my own head. I'd spent 8 years being the only person who knew the truth of those 6 years, and there's a specific kind of tired that comes from being your own sole witness. 3 weeks later, Deborah called Jenna, who called me, and a family dinner got arranged at Brian's house, ostensibly to reconnect since it's been too long, though everyone in that chain of calls understood what it actually was. Stay with me for this part, because it's the one people usually ask about most. If you've ever had to walk back into a room with people who hurt you, holding nothing but the truth and your own composure, subscribe now so you don't miss how this one actually played out. It didn't go the way I expected either. I chose to go. I want to be clear that this was a choice, not an ambush I walked into. I'd had 8 years to build a life where I didn't need anything from that family, financially or otherwise, and going back into a room with them was something I did deliberately, with my own conditions. I picked the setting, or rather, I insisted on one condition before agreeing to Brian's house, that it happen on a Saturday afternoon, with Owen in the next room if I wanted him, and that I could leave the moment I chose to. Brian agreed without asking why that mattered to me. I don't think he understood that the last time I'd been told where to go in a family conversation, I'd ended up packing a suitcase by 10 that night. I brought the folder, not dramatically, not carried in like a prop. It sat in my bag until it was needed, the way any piece of evidence should. Brian's fiancée, the same woman who'd shared the business journal photo without knowing what it would set in motion, met me at the door before anyone else came into the room and quietly told me she was glad I'd come and that she was sorry, in a vague way that suggested she understood more of the situation than she'd been given credit for. She poured me coffee without asking if I wanted any, the way you do for someone you can tell is bracing for something. It was a small thing. It was also the only moment of plain decency I got from anyone in that house before the conversation started, and I've thought about it more than its size would suggest I should. Deborah looked older than 8 years should account for. She'd remarried briefly in year 5 to a man named Gary who left after 14 months, taking a home equity line of credit's worth of debt with him that Deborah hadn't fully understood she'd co-signed. The house, the same one on Larchmont, was 6 weeks from a foreclosure filing. Her car, a leased SUV 2 years past what she could afford, had already been repossessed once and reinstated with a payment plan she was also behind on. She started, as these things usually start, with warmth calibrated to extract something. "You look wonderful," she said. "Successful." She reached across the table like she might touch my hand, and I let the reach happen without meeting it, which she noticed. Then, within 4 minutes, "Family takes care of family, Mara. Whatever's happened between us, that's still true." I let that sit for a second before I answered, because I wanted to be precise. "It is true," I said. "It's just never been true, the direction you mean it." 12 seconds of silence. Brian shifted in his chair. Jenna, sitting slightly apart from her mother, didn't move at all. Deborah recovered fast, the way people do when they've rehearsed a version of a conversation that isn't going the way they practiced. She laid out the ask, more specific than I expected, $11,000 for the car and back payments, help negotiating with the mortgage servicer, and, delivered almost as an afterthought, "You'd have inherited a piece of that house eventually anyway if things had gone differently. This is just early." Brian tried to soften it, the way people who benefit from staying neutral often do. "Nobody's saying you owe anything," he said. "It's more like, you're in a position to help now, and family helps." "I was in a position to help for 6 years," I said. "I did. Nobody's ever once said thank you for that. So before we talk about what I'm in a position to do now, I'd like to talk about what I already did then." That was the sentence that made me open the folder. I didn't raise my voice. I've read enough forensic testimony transcripts to know that volume is what people reach for when they don't actually have the facts, and I had the facts. I laid out 74 monthly mortgage confirmations, in order, on Brian's kitchen table, the same kind of table I'd once eaten dinner at on Larchmont Street believing I belonged there. I laid out the insurance payment history next to it, month by month, the 2-month gap in year 4 circled in red where the policy had briefly lapsed and I'd caught it before a hailstorm could have cost the house its coverage entirely. I laid out a printed log of 41 prescription copays I'd covered between my own paychecks, going back to the year I was 20. I read the totals the way I'd read them to a board, flat, unhurried, one line at a time because I wanted every number to land on its own before the next one arrived. This is $1,140 a month, I said. For 74 months, from my checking account to your mortgage servicer, starting the year Walt's disability check stopped covering it. This is $212 a month in homeowner's insurance for the same period after the policy lapsed once and almost left the house uninsured during a year we had 2 hailstorms. This is not a request for repayment. I'm not asking you for a dollar of it back. I'm showing you this because 8 years ago, in that kitchen, you told me I'd never been family, that I'd just been waiting my turn. I want you to look at what I actually did while I was supposedly waiting. Deborah's face did something I hadn't seen it do in 8 years of imagining this conversation. It cracked, genuinely, for about 4 seconds, into something that looked less like anger and more like fear, maybe even shame. I didn't know it was that much, she said, quiet, almost to herself. Walt never told me. Gas? I thought he was still handling it. For a moment I believed her, and I still do believe that particular sentence was true. Walt had shielded her from the numbers. The same way he'd shielded everyone from most hard things, right up until his heart gave out in the back office of a store that no longer exists. She looked, for those 4 seconds, less like the woman who told me to pack a suitcase and more like someone standing in the wreckage of a decision she hadn't fully understood she was making. I've audited enough estates by now to recognize that particular expression. It's the one people wear when a number finally makes a story they've told themselves for years impossible to keep telling. But the crack closed fast. Within another 10 seconds, she was back to the version of herself I actually knew. Well, you were living there too, she said. It's not like it was pure charity on your end. You had a roof. I had a roof, I said. I also had a job, and an apartment I could have afforded 2 years earlier if I hadn't spent that money keeping yours standing instead. You're welcome to check the math yourself. That's why I brought it. I brought a list too, in a way, though not the kind Deborah had asked Brian's fiancé to help her build. Mine was 1 sentence long, and I'd written it in the attorney's office 3 weeks earlier because I wanted to say it exactly right, without flinching, one time. You said I brought a list, I told her. I brought one too. It has 1 line on it. I'm not paying for a house I was told I never had a place in. Nobody in that kitchen said anything for what felt like a very long time. I counted it later, going over the memory, the way I go over everything. 19 seconds? Jenna was the one who broke it, and not in the direction Deborah wanted. Mom, she said, quiet. I remember the porch light going out. I remember it being out for 4 days before it came back on. I never asked why. I should have asked why. Deborah didn't answer that. She looked at the table, at 74 confirmations she'd never once had to see before, and said the thing she'd say for the rest of that conversation whenever the ground got too solid under someone else's feet, that she'd been grieving, that everyone handles grief differently, that she'd never meant what she said at Walt's wake the way it sounded. I told her calmly that I believed grief was real. I told her I didn't believe it explained 8 years of the same story, told to the same people, unrevised, uncorrected, even after she'd had every chance to learn otherwise. I told her I wasn't going to give her the $11,000, or help negotiate the mortgage, or take on any part of a debt she'd built with a man she married after I was already gone. I told her that if she ever wanted to have an actual relationship with me, not a transactional one, it would start with an apology that didn't have a dollar amount attached to it, and that I wasn't in a hurry to hear one. Owen, who'd stayed in the living room the entire time exactly as I'd asked, came into the kitchen once the folder had been closed and the silence had gone on long enough that it was clearly over. He didn't say anything. He just stood next to my chair. And somehow that was the thing that made Deborah finally look, really look, at the fact that I had built a life in the 8 years she'd spent telling a story about how I hadn't earned one. I packed the folder back into my bag the way I'd unpacked it, slowly, in order, nothing rushed. Brian's fiancé walked us to the door and squeezed my arm once, which I understood to mean more than any sentence she could have found in that moment. In the car, Owen drove because I asked him to, and I didn't cry until we were 4 blocks away, not out of sadness exactly, more like the particular kind of release that comes after holding something steady for longer than you knew you had it in you to hold. He didn't ask me to explain it. He just reached over and turned the radio down. Deborah's house sold 11 weeks later, at a loss, to cover what remained after the foreclosure proceedings started, and a settlement got negotiated by a lawyer Brian found for her, not me. She moved into a 2-bedroom rental across town. I don't know most of the details of how the rest of her debts resolved, because I made the decision, standing in that kitchen, not to track it. Some ledgers, I've learned, you're allowed to just close. Jenna reached out again about 6 weeks after the dinner at Brian's, this time on her own, no group chat, no forwarded screenshot. She asked if we could get coffee, and when we did, she said the thing I'd needed to hear from someone in that family for 8 years, unprompted and specific, that she remembered more than she'd ever admitted to remembering: the birthday nobody mentioned, the porch light, the night I left with one suitcase while she stayed quiet in her own apartment an hour away and told herself it wasn't her place to get involved. She didn't ask for anything in return. We've had coffee 4 times since then. I still don't tell her everything. I'm not in a hurry to. Deborah has not apologized. I don't say that bitterly. It's simply the fact of where that particular relationship sits, closed, the way I told her it would stay until something real changed it. I heard, through Jenna, that she still tells a version of the story where things got complicated with money, which is, I suppose, one way to describe 74 months of receipts. My mother, when I finally told her the full story, the group chat and the folder and the kitchen table, was quiet for a long moment on the phone and then said, I should have asked more about what was going on in that house. I let myself believe you were fine because it was easier than driving 4 states to check. I told her that was true and that I understood it anyway, because I'd spent 8 years learning the difference between a person who fails you out of absence and a person who fails you out of appetite. She has called every Sunday since, a habit that's now outlasted the one Ruth started with me 16 years ago, which feels like its own kind of quiet repair. Brian and I talk occasionally now, mostly logistics, a shared calendar of who's checking on Deborah's rental lease renewal. Nothing warmer than that yet, though he did call me after the foreclosure closed to say plainly that he should have asked more questions 8 years ago instead of assuming his mother had the story right. I told him I appreciated it. I meant it, in the small measured way I mean most things these days. Ruth is 80 now, and I still show up most Saturdays, though it's less about her garden these days and more about the 2 of us and the dog Owen and I adopted last spring, a mutt named Baxter who Ruth insists on feeding table scraps against my explicit instructions. Sundays are still grilled cheese, though I make it now, and Ruth still asks real questions, and I still answer them the way I did when I was 19 and she was the only person keeping a light on for me. Owen proposed in her backyard in June, among the last of her tomato plants, and Ruth cried before either of us said a word because she'd apparently known for 2 weeks and had been sitting on it, which is the only secret I've ever known her to keep. People sometimes ask, when I tell this story, whether I regret paying all those years without ever hearing so much as a thank you for it. I don't. I paid because Walt asked, and because I loved him, and that stays true regardless of what got said about it afterward at a funeral home on Route 9. What I'd do differently if I could isn't the paying. It's the 8 years I spent believing I had to earn the right to be believed before I ever asked for it. Somewhere in there, I mistook silence for strength, and it took a kitchen table and 74 confirmations to finally understand the difference. That's my story. 74 confirmations, 1 navy blue folder, and 1 line I only had to say once. Family was never the people who share your last name and decide, 8 years later, that you're useful again. It's the person who notices your porch light is out and doesn't wait to be asked why. If this landed somewhere real for you, tell me. If someone in your life only showed up once the numbers changed, I want to hear that story too, and I promise I'll actually read it. That's my story, and I'll see you in the next one.